Tudor, right?
Greetings, one and all. I'm DJ Elliott, and I'm here with the wonderful Anthony Blake, who we thought would do a little show on verifying Gurdjieff's laws. So, Tony, tell me about verifying Gurdjieff's laws.
Well, there is about this a lot of questions, and I'm going to start and indulge myself a bit in the questions because it's not so straightforward as it might seem. And I can intimate that the broad direction of what I'm going to talk about is to uh, kind of point out that there's really no serious attempt to verify Gurdjieff's laws at all. There's a lot of talk about them and repeating of what other people have said, but there's very little, as far as I can see, as far as I know, and I've been looking for 50 odd years now, very little in the way of actual investigation. I remember, you probably do, that Gurdjieff at some point talks and say, well, we need this, I expect this minimum of people, that is some capability of knowing evidence and using reasoning. And I accept that is just that's the bottom line, But he expects more of you, but at least he wants that. But to my opinion, in some respects, a lot of people are not getting up to that ordinary human standard at all.
Yes, he said that to J.G. Bennett, who says it in his book, which I've forgotten which one it is. And Bennett says we need 200 people, but that would have been back in them days. So, probably more now.
Well, that's 200 people about isn't it about overcoming war? If there are 200 conscious people could stop war. That's a big claim. I don't know if I can get onto that sort of claim. But I want to start with this. Uh, well, first of all, to point out for everybody listening in is that my background is, if say, academic, is scientific, and part of my reason for being so attracted to John Bennett was that he shared this kind of background in the sense that he was both immersed in mathematical physics and also an admirer of Gurdjieff's teaching at the same time. And he actually consciously set himself to make these as one, you know, uh, unify them as respect. And so that obviously, as many people say, the universe or the reality must be one, there's only one, or even that's in question, of course, these days. And so what is really scientific and what is really Gurdjieffian, if you can say Gurdjieff as an adjective, should coincide if they're real. Now, so I was very attracted to, and I could see sometimes he had to, in his later life, diverge from Gurdjieff and do things differently, but he always remained a faithful follower, perhaps until his interaction with Idris Shah, which put him under a lot of stress, but made him pronounce himself more as his own man, not just a follower of Gurdjieff, but as an independent man. You see. So there's a lot of considerations of people and their stages in their life and when they met Gurdjieff and what they wanted to do and had their own aims. But I want to center a moment on this very term to verify. Now, quite some years ago, when I came across this, it was a moment I can remember where I was actually. It may seem strange, in the garden where a place I was staying near to Bennett, and I suddenly realized, in a sense, one can verify anything whatsoever. You know, why? Because you can work according to a cognitive bias. And that's the term now, cognitive bias. And what this means, you just select the information which supports your belief and ignore the information which does not support your belief. This is what you can see in the unnameable political circles in America at the same time, which exhibit this sort of behavior. And they will not listen to any contrary evidence whatsoever. Now, from my scientific background, you come across a radically different idea about something like verification. And I say it's something like because it's almost the opposite in a way, is falsification. As you see, the great philosopher of science called a man called Karl Popper, who came from communist countries, settled in England and so on, he was very frightened of authoritarian regimes and belief systems and so on. But he said a truly scientific statement can be falsified. And this really distinguishes them from other things which people might offer as a matter of opinion. Because, it's, they actually design what they say and speak about in the way so it can't be falsified. It's all to do with persuading people that it is so. And this falsification is very, I think, effective, pragmatic, practical sort of looking at it. But it's, to my mind, not being considered enough by people, us ordinary people. Front of Gurdjieff's teaching, you've got to look at yourself and say, what what do I know for myself? You see, what have I verified? And so the intention is very good, ask that question. But then one's mind is all going to be turned towards finding evidence which supports them and ignoring the rest. Some people ignore the rest in almost willful way by saying anything contrary to Gurdjieff's teaching or his ideas and so on must be wrong and should be rejected itself, because they ignore that. Now, I'm going to go to a little technical detail about statistics. Forgive me for this, but it's a pretty essential thing. And this is about belief and evidence. A lot of people think about uh, experiments and tests, particularly in medicine, for example, as almost infallible. They say have a test, you've got a certain result, and that's the result. But every test has a probability of being in error. Every actual test is right. And this came up, to take a well-known sort of example of incidences of breast cancer. You could have a result that said a poor woman has breast cancer, but it's in that number of cases which is a false positive, you see. So this has got to be taken into account. That's what happens. And then another thing to take into account is just to give you and it is the probabilities. And I must add another idea here as a generalization. Most people don't understand probabilities. They're in this abstract world of true and false, black and white, and so you get this fascism and fanaticism and argument and so on. But to assess the probability is for most people, they can't handle it. It's why people are puzzled by quantum mechanics. So you also have to take into account, say, this thing about breast cancer, which is a good example because it has very serious consequences for people. And that is to say, you've got to take into account just what is the likelihood of any woman having breast cancer. That's a factor to take into account. Now, there's a system of calculation about the probability which takes all this into account. Not only it starts with what is my belief, then I see some evidence, and how do I measure that the influence of that evidence? There is a test, say, and I got a result, but I have to take into account the context, the whole context. What's the inherent likelihood of it being wrong? And what's the kind of likelihood of it happening in the population at large? And you put it all together, and it produces a kind of shift then in your estimation of how probable it is. I mean, in terms of breast cancer, the shift can go from, if people take a test on its face value, because it was 100% liability, I got breast cancer. If you go through the Bayesian, what's it called, Bayesian statistics, it can turn out to have only about 15% likelihood of having brain cancer. And these are real figures, but they're not the absolute figures, which most people in the primitive mentation of the times take for granted. You've got to do an absolute. Is it true? Is it false? This kind of thing. But life isn't like that at all. And you've got to weigh up the probabilities to invest your life. Now, I mentioned this man in the name Bayesian because Bayes, it's one of these remarkable stories in science. He was a vicar or minister in the 18th century, and he devised this method of statistics, and he intended to address things such like what's the probability of the story of Moses in the Bible being true? And he was interested in these theological questions. But what he developed was so wide in its possible application that he became gradually known and over 2 centuries, has operated. For example, one of the cases where it was done about 20 years ago, one of the planes which disappeared over the Atlantic, and people searched for it, but they used Bayesian statistics, and this did find the plane, which they wouldn't have gone from the traditional methods, but that method enabled them to actually do it. So there's some anecdotal evidence of its supremacy. So Bayesian and what it brings into the picture, see, Bayesian statistics, you've got to start with admitting what you already believe. And it's a belief. And they're saying, that's all right, people have beliefs. Sure. But you've got to be honest about this. And then you can weigh up the evidence against you. Now, there's no, as far as I see, been no attitude like that in the Gurdjieff followers, towards Gurdjieff, because they're all looking for ideas, information which support what he's saying.
Hold on, I have to say that again because you froze then. They're all looking for.
What supports their belief, believing in Gurdjieff. And I'll come later to questions about uh, not doing that. What is it like? And for myself, I don't myself uh, sometimes actually believe in some of the things at all what Gurdjieff says, in spite of the fact that I know Mr. Bennett insisted that the literal understanding of Beelzebub is a reality and what he said he actually meant and so on. I don't agree with him, just as he and himself, Bennett eventually in his life would say, Mr. Gurdjieff said this, and I remember the extreme example of this when he was at Sherborne. He said, Gurdjieff says, we do not have an eye, but we can get one. But I, Bennett, say, we do not have an eye and we can't get one, which is a pretty radical departure, but this is what he said, you see. But this is not, and I want to unfold, hopefully, my narrative about this is not to just dump all of Gurdjieff as nonsense. A lot of it, I think, is nonsense. It may be deliberate nonsense or humorous nonsense or just provocative nonsense or anything. But but still, he's a very, very extraordinary man.
Gurdjieff did say, "Don't take everything I say for truth and go and verify it for yourself."
Yes. So, yeah. Yeah. Oh, let me think from here. You see, there are what could be some examples. I'm going to work around to these laws, his famous law 3 and law 7. And there was always stuck in my mind a comment on this from Welsh man, that he made this very valuable illustrated talk about the movements. I've forgotten when it was. And he has this captions showing the sort of movements, and he's got this description of the law of 7 one point in one of his captions of the inexorable law. And I just really bridled at this notion, this inexorable law, this, I think these are some kind of fascists or something. This is the law, and there's a kind of fury behind it, and it's just really, it's like saying they're just pounding that this is really true. It's like Khrushchev or Trump or something. This is really true, and you people don't believe in it are stupid and all the rest of it. But no, inexorable law? What on earth is this? But indeed, what is a law? That I'll come to in a minute. I want to pause now and look at the something, a little bit about the scope of the writing he has in Beelzebub's Tales. Because nowadays I start from the kind of attitude that, at very least Gurdjieff is a creative genius, and his mastery in writing as well as in music and choreography is quite an extraordinary accomplishment, and so we must take him seriously on that account. But in his Beelzebub's Tales, he did something quite exceptional, and which made a divergence from Ouspensky, and which meant a divergence from his Moscow days, his Russian days. And the main thing was that in the Russian days, you had this seemingly scientific language about hydrogens and octaves and ratios and ladders of ascent and all that sort of thing in the enneagram. And it all was obviously, to my mind, deliberately couched in a form to make it sound sort of scientific, because what Gurdjieff thought would appeal to people at that time. But then he changed when he came to his own writings. And he pointed out, the story in Paris after the war, he heard the Inserts and Miracles for the first time. It was being read there, and so he said,
Yes, and
I,
he said that it was very true to his what he said to Ouspensky, didn't he?
that's right. I love Ouspensky now. He write what I say in this kind of thing. He said, but you have to read Beelzebub to know how to really do it, to put across these ideas. And in brief, what he did in Beelzebub's Tales, which was perceived by this extraordinary writer and scholar, Denis Sorat, who, as you probably know, uh, came across the early version of Beelzebub, which was circulated in 1931, and acknowledged it as a new mythology. And even he called it an extraterrestrial.
I didn't know that. Okay, I knew he said it was a new mythology.
Yeah, but extraterrestrial, and it's very shocking. Uh, but the further thing to mention about Denis Thorat was that there was recorded some conversations he had with Gurdjieff, which I take to be quite honest and down to earth and very valuable as a reference. But again, I'm choosing my references which suit my story, this kind of thing. And so, but for the moment, I want you to pause with this notion of it as a mythological text. And this is so interesting for me because I want also to take the story of Gurdjieff in context of the general culture in Europe and so on, and in the world, and not treat him in isolation. He was a man of his times, like any other man. Um, it was just by accident in surfing YouTube, I came across this material, excuse me, about actually T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, the poem. It's a very interesting observation that the man makes about the modernism and modern poetry and the rest of it. And I was astonished to hear that near the end of the 19th century, Mallarmé, the great French poet, talked about the tendency in modern poetry that it would not say anything direct at all. It would hint and suggest, persuade, you see. And it would be up to the reader to struggle to find out what it's talking about.
Hmm, like somebody else we know.
Exactly like someone else we know. Well, this is actually about 1890 or something like that, writing, just something like a lot of people looking at Gurdjieff are almost like I want to scream and say, it seems to appear to have no education at all about what's going on contextually. I mean, what was incredible changes going on around that time, including, of course, what intervened between Gurdjieff in Moscow and in Paris was, of course, the First World War, and how this shattered so many dreams and beliefs about things and ways of working and so on. But the mythological way, which is woven, like in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which is taken as a masterpiece of modern 20th century poetry. And Eliot had a lot of influence about the way people thought about expressing ideas and so on. It, it's interesting that Eliot went back to these, not quite ancient texts, but texts about ancient mythology, like the Golden Bough. I'm sure you've heard of the Golden Bough by Fraser. I've only read little fragments of it. And also on, what was that other one? Oh, yes, it was Weston, I think, of the woman. He quotes in it from Ritual to Romance, because he cites her as a footnote in one version of The Wasteland. And this is about these guys, whatever the mistakes they made, research into these early stories. Now, now I switch to another little story about Gurdjieff and his father. I think more and more and more it takes that's very important, the fact that his father was a bard, a poet, a singer, and this sort of thing. And you remember he told this incredible story of how he read in a magazine somewhere a translation of a Sumerian text in the cuneiform about
Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh, thank you, in which you have the story of the flood. And he read it, he said he read it in a magazine, and suddenly realized it was exactly the same story as his father had sung through an oral tradition over all those thousands of years. And it's a very striking, exciting part. I don't know, can't say whether it's true or not, but it gave rise to Gurdjieff saying, then later life, how much he saw there was so much wealth in this early mythology, in these stories, which he could have taken account of and didn't. Also, he might have spoken about that because during this conversation with Denis Surat, he pointed out he and his friends, and I love that phrase, he used, me and my friends, not, well, they called the Seekers of the Truth, they had a fancy name, but it was just like me and my mates. Just, it wasn't, because Surat asked him, do you come from any school? And he said, no, it was just me and my friends. And we looked into all this old stuff, what we could get our hands on, monuments and poems and dances and whatever we could get hold of. And we began to get a picture about this ancient stuff. But looking at that, reading that, it seems to me that probably they would be attuning themselves to this, what is called the mythological way, which is of expressing things and saying things and so on. Now, this is make another little jump to Owen Barfield, who was one of the inkblots, I think there were C.S. Lewis and
Inklings. One of the
Tolkien,
Inklings.
the
He was
Inklings.
one of the Inklings.
That's right. And very important. Of course, Owen Barfield was also very influential by Steiner, which is,
Absolutely. Yeah.
but he's supposed to have a lot of influence on Cold Tolkien and C.S. Lewis because there's this into this mode of expression, which you a mythological kind of mode, which you call it, which then relates, and I'll rapidly make another allusion and come back online, I hope, to Giambattista Vico, who talked about the four ages, a language from a kind of very primitive to a poetic, then mythical, and then to a religious, and then to a period it's in Vico of a kind of chaos, which obviously reflects on where we are now, and then it recycles and so on. But this notion of the ages, and in this regard about these transitions of language, and going back to what I saw on YouTube and associations in my mind about the modern world or modern art and so on. You see, Eliot really was an admirer of James Joyce, and
Mhm.
because his poem Wasteland was published about the same time as Joyce's Ulysses. And what was Ulysses was a rendering of the story of the Jew in Dublin according to the Odyssey of Homer.
I always found the Ulysses, though I read it too young, I think I couldn't understand it. But I think if I read it now, I would have a
I,
better understanding of
I
it.
I think you would. It's also if you can't get any of readings of it because the sound of the language is very, very important there. And I always say if you get a reading of Joyce, it must be done by an Irishman and preferably by Joyce and so because the language and you get to Finnegan's Wake. I mean, I've always said to people that's one of my dreams, which I'll never fulfill, is doing comparative study of Beelzebub with Finnegan's Wake, because they have this. What do you get? See this tremendous strangeness with language, these new terms, these bizarre stories and all the rest of it. It's in the same mode. So there's that all background to what I say. Now, in making this composition of Beelzebub's Tales, you see, I've thrown in now a story which I think you will know. I think it was in Paris with Gurdjieff and Bennett, and Gurdjieff took him on the street. He pointed to his shop. He said, "You see that there? That's where I took the name Bulmarshano from." And there was a butcher shop. And this belongs to this way. I love the French word bricolage, which is making use of the bits and pieces you've got around you. But it's also a feature of the modernist way. You don't do it in a kind of reason pattern, but you pick bits here and bits there. And also what matters in it is that you get this combination between the lowest, the most rudimentary and the most banal, and the highest and the most refined. These are not treated as separate at all anymore, which is Gurdjieff's way of writing, you see. So in the way you can treat Gurdjieff as a modernist, you know. These kind of modernists look back into the deep past, what was happening in the origins of mind and all the rest of it. So that's very exciting. Now,
It is. We need to have an understanding of the past to understand why we are here now.
that is so. And it's, I don't know, I shouldn't say and as if I had no more insight, but it's along the lines of you can only kind of create the present, as you say, through the past. And there's other appearing which is now appearing in various ways around the world. You go into the past and you discover things which in a way weren't known before, or or they'd gone, or faded, or been hidden, or obscured, or forgotten, or something. You see, that's where a lot of people have taken it so obvious, you know, Gurdjieff's Atlantis. Atlantis signifies this, in a way, the forgotten part of our own psyche. You know, in a way, conscience is in Atlantis, you know, this kind of thing. And there's all this recent talk about the imaginal world where these meanings exist and so on. So that the Atlantis is our own subconscious, this kind of thing. So the idea of it being drowned and covered over is that, you know, the coming of this superficial. And not just another segue on that. I'm very appreciative of Ian McGilchrist, the one who's the spokesman for the two sides of the brain, and his narrative, which he's researched assiduously about changes in poetry and the arts in general and philosophy, which corresponds to what he believes is the record of a change of emphasis in the balance of the two brains. The ideal state being a balance between these two brains. These are one called, well, these are rubbed as analytical, and the other one more experiential, feeling the whole and all that kind of thing. And in a sense, obviously, the two together is what the gold is, you know, what the goodie is, you know. But he said there's been a sort of shift. And so he had this book called The Master and His Emissary. And the master should have been the right side of the brain, which sees the whole, and it sent out material into the left brain, which took control of it. And you can see that the last 2,000 years or so, at least, have been dominated by this kind of mind. It is the bureaucrat's mind. It's the fascist mind. It's all that kind of thing. It's not in itself bad, but by itself, it is a disaster. Uh, so
They're trying to shut down people's left-hand brain, aren't they? So that we are more free thinking and artistic. And I think, in a way, bringing the subconscious comes up through that. And then because we haven't got the bridge to bring the two together, sometimes people can't. Like you say, it's the golden, it's the treasure, isn't it? If we can bring our two brains together to connect our two sides of our brain.
uh, yes, you know, physiology is called the corpus callosum. And also, we could almost treat it. People don't. I don't know why, as a third kind of brain, which is it's the one, it's the meaning between. I love betweenness. You know, it's the between which is the most treasured part. But I'm going to revert to some of the sources. I wanted to put these in, saying Gurdjieff, like any art, like Eliot, you pick up these things, what people spoke like in the pub, you see whatever it was, uh, they're getting drunk and what they can come up with it, or what the great poets could say, and he puts it into the same verse, you know, just puts them together. Uh, so if I bring up some seemingly ordinary, quotation marks, secular, you know, non-spiritual sources, people can shudder and say, "Oh, you're not seeing the refinements of life, the highest spiritual natures of life. You're drawing on this stuff which is low, like a lot of Gurdjieffians, still um, treats psychology or psychoanalysis as rubbish, as an inferior thing, and they always think they are beyond this. You know, you see, oh, it's only for people who are damaged need to be brought up to some normality. But we're at the normality, we want to get to higher. You see, this kind of thing. So there's that general rejection of psychology and its methods and ideas as saying, well, it's not Gurdjieffian, therefore it's no good. But there is a case for taking it seriously, and so these sources of the two I got to cite. I'm putting it in here because I just want to tell people I think like this, and uh, 'cause I haven't got anybody to really acknowledge what I say because it seems to be quite rational. That is to say, the design of spaceships, and you were involved in our efforts to look at
Yeah.
that text, weren't you, uh,
Yes.
in the theatre group? Uh, and in there, you got this final design by the Archangel. I love that. Archangels designing spaceships was
Yes.
really, really beautiful, wasn't it? And
Archangel Harrington, wasn't it?
Harrington, that's right. That's right, Arthur Harrington. And he um, clued in or tuned in to this thing, the law of falling. That's a lovely one. It's one of Gurdjieff's lovely ideas, the law of falling. Um, I soon looked at that rather in a very straightforward physical way. And he's saying falling towards cosmic concentrations and so on. Gravity, a mundane thing. Can I talk about just gravity, not some kind of hoo-ha stuff? No, but okay, gravity. And that's it. What do I get? First man in the moon. Cavorite. Professor Cavor. He invents this spaceship which has these shutters. They put these shutters up and it cuts off the gravitational attraction.
Is that Jules Verne?
No, H.G. Wells.
Oh, wait, shit. Right, okay,
Yeah,
yes.
I know,
I knew
mixed
I
up
knew.
Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, right? Yeah, yeah. No, it's there. It says, and even I wrote papers about this in and you got the diagram of it and the design and all the rest of it. And I knew that H.G. Wells was translated into Russian, I think, by about 1900.
Oh,
So he was around, you see. Uh, oh, that's going to be another little spin-off. Why almost nobody mentions Gurdjieff's contemporaries in Russia were the cosmists. Now, the cosmists had this dream of uh, what you call it, interplanetary travel and the advancements of human existence through technology. And it started in the 19th century. And in about 1900, you had this extraordinary man, Sliakovsky, who was called the godfather of, or the godfather of space travel, who wrote extensively about space travel. And then you also had Vernadsky, who had the idea of the biosphere, which led actually through to these friends of mine who built Biosphere 2 in the Arizona desert, and they based it on Vernadsky, and Gurdjieff invented its ideas. Most people don't know this, of course. Like, what a round idea. So, but why? There's no mention of Gurdjieff actually meeting these guys. They're incredible
but what if
visionaries.
they were people, or maybe one of them was a member of the Seekers of Truth? Because we don't actually know who they are, do we?
Well, not the Seekers of Truth. No, we don't. We don't. We do know who the members of the Cosmists were, because some of them were, uh, published books and
Mm.
lectures and all the rest of it. But that's a good point. And about them, as you know, it's the general consensus that Gurdjieff did have, colleagues, and one would be surprised if he didn't, because what he brought with him to Russia, say, is such a masterful construction of systems of ideas and diagrams and so on. If he did it by himself, then my gosh. But we know that his father was real, probably, and Father Bosch from the cathedral was real. And but maybe some suggestion Skridlov, the professor, is real, and Lubavitsky, the one who studied religions, is real, but we don't know. The rest is taken as more mythological. But mythological, in a way, you see, it's not to make too crude a contrast with evidentiary empirical science. It's what's important in this to get a feeling for is the language, the way of doing things, the way of talking about things. See, this is what was Bennett was keen on. He did it in his sort of more academic way, but it was extraordinary. He went down to say, you can't you can't talk about new ideas in the old language. You've got to change the language. And people don't appreciate the influence of language, and you've got to change the very way. And so we know, going back to the modern age, um, these changes in literature, as in painting and music and so on, were radical changes in the form, the way things were done. But my old friend, I don't know if he's still alive now, um, Larry Pensinger, who wrote The Moon of Hoybin, he used to say the real revolution of the 20th century was in the reader, because people had to learn to read in a different way with this modern literature. Yeah. As somebody facing, like you, facing Ulysses, how do I read this? You've got to find something up. And going back to this statement by Malami, in front of us, why are they making it difficult? Why can't they just tell a story in a simple way? But no, there's a whole tendency here, an undercurrent. And the other reference I wanted to make was from Meetings of Remarkable Men this time, which is toward the end, I think it's the last chapter before the material question, when they meet Father Giovanni,
Mhm.
remember, in Kafiristan, which is a part of Abyssinia, no, that's right. Is it, was it Abyssinia? No, it's in Abyssinia. What was it?
Get
The,
the places a bit mixed up actually. I was just going to grab my copy that's here while you
all
talk.
right. I'm just, because I'm old, it was a track, it's so Afghanistan. Afghanistan. It's a part of Afghanistan. There you go. That's it. Okay. But and what the story says, he and Skridlov do it, and they dress up as dervishes or priests or something. Remember that? You get
Yes,
that?
yes.
Now, I don't know if I checked with you before. Have you seen at least the movie, The Man Who Would Be King?
Brilliant film.
Brilliantly, Sean Connery, Michael Caine, and so on. And what is it? They're actually two mercenaries. They dress up as dervishes and so on to go to Kafiristan. Now, I can't believe there's not a connection. It's
So
so
I have to
specific.
find out who wrote that film then.
Rudyard Kipling, no, well, Roger Kipling wrote the book. I don't know who did the film.
Oh, I see. Right. So, right. Okay.
Roger Kipling had all those experiences that are supposed to be mercenaries in India and trying to how to say, exploit people and all the rest of it. But when you look at it and say, look, dressed up as dervishes, getting into Kafiristan, wow, come on. Uh,
Yes.
but Gurdjieff was not fussy. And so he picked it. He said, I think he had an eye for an ear for a good story. Yeah, and throw it in. Uh, I always
So you're
thought about,
saying Gurdjieff stole Kipling's idea.
oh yes, absolutely, with no acknowledgement, of course, because it's he's pissing on Western literature as he pisses on most things Western and modern, and
Or
that's
maybe
an
he read the book and thought, I'm going to go and do that.
you will. Well, it was yes, that would be really something, wouldn't it? That would be really extraordinary. So there are two examples, and I think possibly two one could describe with stories about the Gobi Desert. There was a Swedish expedition around that time, which he could have drawn on, and all the rest of it. And why not? But in relation to these stories, you always have this problem that Gurdjieff never gives you his actual sources ever. He
Oh,
might,
you broke up then again. Did you say he never gives you his sources?
that's right.
Right.
No, like well, in a very blatant way, he many times talks about an ancient manuscript. Nobody ever sees his ancient manuscripts, you see. And the one time he quotes something is from this, at the end of the third series, this Russian newspaper he picks up in New York, which is a part of his technique, of course, but it's not an ancient manuscript by any means. And there is this, well, two things I'd throw in mention is an uncertainty about his movie watching, because I know I always had the impression from Mr. B, but he was a bit stuffy about such things, he wasn't really interested in Gurdjieff going to the picture, so to speak. But I think Paul, was it Paul?
Igman Taylor.
Yes, right. That's right. Exactly. He insisted that Gurdjieff was always going to the cinema, and that sort of thing. And there's this discrepancy there. Because in the written text, you only get the critical part where Gurdjieff says, "Oh, there is this film about two brothers, but I will make a film about three brothers," which is ludicrous in itself, because of course they already made Dostoevsky uh, story into a movie. Eh, I'm only going to go off to who played the part of. It's very interesting of the monk in it, but there you are. You get that. And what else might he have picked up? It's a And the part of the modernistic picture, it's very striking, isn't it? You got these two guys early on in Paris of René Daumal, you heard about, and
Yes.
Pierre Schaeffer. Is René Daumal, a leading surrealist, yeah, and Pierre Schaeffer, who's the creator of a whole new branch of avant-garde music called musique concrète. And you said one can have this image of Gurdjieff as, oh, it's backward looking in terms of the ancient wisdom, blah, blah, blah. But he seemed to be au fait with the what's cool, what's really going on in this sort of thing.
I'd
But
like to
it's
throw another one in the mix about that because I've only just found out about Oswald Spengler in his book, The Decline of the West, which is all about how civilizations only last for 2,000 years. And it was very popular in the 1920s.
uh,
Now, so I'm only just learning about this. So I'm again wondering if that's another book that Gurdjieff would have come across because it would have been in all the papers, interviews with him, and things like that. And Spengler talks about how civilizations rise for 1,000 years and then they decline over 1,000 years. A bit like
yeah.
some of the things in Beelzebub's Tales.
It does, doesn't it? And I bet it picked up with his theory of epochs, but I should often want to criticize him because he's so unclear about his system of epochs and what it changes. But you do get this notion from it, don't you, of a kind of weird clockwork going round. Oh, the clock strike 12 again. Here we go, decline. This kind of thing. And it was Spengler, I think, it was the chap who really popularized it the in the West. Yeah. And then let's jump to another topic that's due to Wim van Dulleman. The two things, in fact, was very full of the idea. He was very aware of Gurdjieff's contextualization. He was not an island to himself. He was, and he was obviously a man very capable of intense observation and learning and picking up, of music and art and so on from everywhere. And then I'm jumping to put a little clip here from that guy, um, Boyhood with Fritz Peters. You see, as a lovely example, he said Gurdjieff in his writings always uh, attacks homosexuals and all the rest of it. And there is this guy, rampant homosexual, who gives us stories about Gurdjieff, which the Foundation and other people would never do about, having these orgies and shacked up with this strange woman, putting shit on the walls and all this kind of stuff. You see, it's like chalk and cheese, the two versions. And the piety attributed to Gurdjieff in the film, These Remarkable Men, is something you don't want to be very suspicious of because it's also holy, holy, so to speak. It's like none of the scenes like Gurdjieff wailing in with his fist to help some group of British
Soldiers, yeah.
sailors, in the pub.
No, Vic Viseska, or whatever her name was. If I'd made Meetings with Remarkable Men, I'd have made it very differently. And
Yeah.
I've always wanted to, if I had the money to make a movie, I've always said I would do Fritz Peters by Boyhood.
Wow.
I would love to make that into me. I think it'd be so entertaining.
They ought to be damn entertaining. But that reminds you, as I may have told you in the past, I did tell you about when the Meeting Remarkable came out, and a lot of us were dissatisfied with it. And I remember having a conversation with him and Anthony Schaffer. He was a screenwriter. He wrote scripts for Hitchcock, for example. And he did that wonderful film Wicker Man. He wrote Wicker Man, and so on. And talking about this, and sort of Schaffer's attitude was just because he's in the business. He said, you ought to get a decent director like Kubrick, to make this. And Bennett made a kind of treatment, sketch print treatment of it, and in which such things were sort of stuck in my mind because it was very challenging. He said, they shouldn't neglect Gurdjieff's sex life. He said it was even after the washerwoman employed at the Prairie. Some respectably married women with children. He was sometimes absolutely rampant, as he is. But it's been censored, a lot of it's been censored. So there is that
Oh,
thing
can
of
you imagine if Kubrick had made that movie? Oh my gosh, I love
Yeah,
Kubrick.
right. Yeah, yeah. But of course, the foundation would never relinquish it because with an artist like that, you can't put him in what you can call it handcuffs or something about it. You just have to let him rip. It's like, but you see, he could do a collaboration. The Kubrick Arthur C. Clarke collaboration about 2001 was magnificent. They could go together, and Gurdjieff himself planted it with Thomas de Hartmann in the music. But the other thing we went to drew attention to was, or the one thing I was reading towards was the fact that I think his name was Muller. I'm not sure about the name. He was from Theosophy in the late 19th century, and he was very strong in the idea of the subconscious self. And we went to very much felt that that influenced Gurdjieff in terms of the subconsciousness and so on. He could have picked it up then, but he could have picked it up from there. No, no. But then there's the movements, because I would say that Gurdjieff himself says he started with Swedish gymnastics. He puts it in Mr. Barker Men. And people forget 1890, the books about this sold by in the million. It was all around, you see. But then also that chap Dalcroze, or Dalcroze, I don't know how to pronounce it,
Yes, Delcroze,
who
involved with Steiner's eurythmics and, of course, Gurdjieff's movements. He knew De Salzman, didn't he?
well, that's where I think he knew. No, it's where he knew better Jessima Howarth,
Oh, that's it, yes.
and then there was this crisis because had this scene when Delcroze's students were shouting that plagiarists, plagiarists when they were showing the Gurdjieff movements.
I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
Oh yeah, the guy who went through that was the whole story. He swiped a lot of the stuff from it, and in a way, well, what do you say? I can't the word. It's flattery. It's the highest form of praise,
Praise, yes.
something like that, isn't it? Because because Gurdjieff knew a good thing, so I said, that, and put it in. But there's continuing problems about the movements, but this sense that it could have drawn on, and this is quite a thing, what was happening in the West, in this tremendous revolution, which included, I think most importantly to say, and it leads me to another topic, the some degree of the liberation of women, because imagine it's worth things were in 1900, the constraints put upon women and the barriers put upon women in that time. And then there's a lot of movement by women in movement to get movements which would enable them to be freed from this. And did you know there's a whole issue around the amazing innovation of the time was the gym slip, the clothes for schoolgirls. They had to be modest enough, but free enough. You would imagine, it was so important to have that. So, and it's therefore not in a way surprising that around Gurdjieff were these particular women like Jetta Hyers and Salzman, who had a sense of the significance of movement for women, even though, of course, it wasn't just made part of the feminist movement, but this appreciation uh, was there. So in talking about these things, you can get it too linear and say, oh, he told him and he told her and here told, as if it was a line. There's never a line. It's a mosaic. So that's all about that. Now, what comes next in all of this? Well, eh,
Can I just ask you something before you go on so I don't throw you off? So we was talking about being at the beginning, being independent. I think the Gurdjieff work in the end is to help you become independent. And I think that's where it's gone wrong with a lot of groups. They don't become independent and they're all still clinging to each other. But I think Gurdjieff's intention was you go off to become an independent, wholesome being.
right on, lady, right on, lady. Because, this extraordinary conduct, which is quite opposite to anybody else, is kind of people really getting it, and so he sent them off. Like De Hartmann. De Hartmann wanted to go. He was cried or something, but he set him free, you know. And I've known my limited life experience about this. If you stay in the presence of somebody with charisma and that kind of power, they can be totally stifling. I think Gurdjieff appreciated it. You're dead right to bring attention to this. It's, it's for independence, and you are getting in a lot of Gurdjieff groups. They become in groups, cultish and so on. And anybody questioning the status quo is treated as a pariah and, liable to be defamed, and abused. This is like Bennett was. He was dreadfully abused by people in the foundation and the conservatives, right to his face. Almost what you call it, defamation, character assassination, and so on of him. Uh, Completely intolerant things. And was he would do such things as trying to take care of the interests of the family of Gurdjieff, which he worked hard at, uh, and then he had to fight Madame de Salps and so on, wanted to control everything, all the materials and writings, for herself and her ideas. But there it is. But I want to lose sight of your fact about this independence. You see, how can you, it's a kind of oxymoron, is how can you get taught to be independent? Because I always felt that was a problem with, some of JGB's hopes, because he was a wonderful man, wonderful teacher and all the rest of it. And he did these things, but he was always looking for the more advanced groups and so on. But suddenly it dawned on me eventually to say, well, problem is, always these more advanced groups were still under his control. So it had to be an extenuation of what he was doing already. It couldn't be anything independent. So it's a real issue you're raising here, because independence, in a way, requires rebellion of a sort, or it's going out on a limb, uh, and it's very well. I was going to make a gross generalization. It's very rare for leaders of groups and so on to relinquish their control over people. It's extremely rare, uh, you know, and to welcome birthright. But I thought it was, as a young man, how you could accept being questioned and criticized by us, and these upstarts, just Trentons and so on, could just say, Mr. B, what about so and so? And he would accept it. But in the spiritualists, because they're laden down this belief that there is this higher realm of superior truths, which this man's got access to. We keep on saying the words, we'll be connected with it. That's all it amounts to. It keeps on saying the words, you see. And so you don't want to change anything because you might be violating these higher truths, which I'd say, if it's a really higher truth, doesn't give a monkeys about the form of things, the rules or anything like that. It's creative. It must be at least creative and so on. So this is very good. You're raising that. Think about
They like want a mechanical law that continues, just
yeah.
keeps on rolling when we can see it. Like I myself am with you on this, that law can evolve as people begin to perhaps understand it better or work with it, then it can move to the next step or something.
Well, this is true. As again, in our previous conversations, or so it in any way, I was always very struck by Grotowski, the Polish avant-garde theatre director, who was a great admirer of Gurdjieff, and sometimes he's taken as the fourth way teacher himself, this Polish Yeah. There's some indirect reference to him in the film Dinner with Andre. He always said this fourth way should be a way of research. You know, and in today's context with the Gurdjieff, you think, research? What's that then? There's nothing like that
No,
going
because
on.
people want it fixed.
Yeah.
Not fixed because Gurdjieff's given us something to get us to keep going forward with continuing the research. I find this, I call them old school, that they want to stay blinded to the laws and the books and don't change anything. We don't have to change Gurdjieff's wording in his books, but
No,
the system will change in us as we work with it.
that's right. And I was struck by years ago when I was actually writing my first book on the Enneagram, and I was in touch with the man who was at that time, I'll tell you his name, the secretary of the Gurdjieff Society, based in London, which is equivalent to the foundation. And he was an extraordinarily nice man and very helpful to me in everything. But he said to me, and I was horrified, said, there's never amongst his group, there's never any discussion of Beelzebub at all. Nobody looks into it at all.
No, I have myself actually. I have one-to-ones with people. I've also been at other groups and even the A&D conference. It surprises me how many people have never read Beelzebub's Tales.
Oh, it's incredible, isn't it? It's absolutely incredible. You just go, duh. This kind of thing. Yeah. And of course, I went about this man who hopefully says he knew that the people in that group set about themselves want to do this so-called new translation. It was a total lie because none of them knew Russian. And what they were doing effectively was translate. It's insanity, translating the French edition into English and calling it the original edition. It's so you do get these critical minds around, but they're mostly uh, like he said to me, don't cite me in your book as a reference, he said, because, and he was obviously going to be embarrassed if they knew that he was helping me and this kind of thing. It's just so close-minded, it's unbelievable. What does it need to become independent? I try to remember the name of that man who wrote this book, something, he was about teachers and gurus, and it's named like Alan something. I don't know if you recognize it, because a lot of people who went to Chevron had read it, and I was impressed by this. But anyway, he was an American and kind of maybe a priest. Um, he wasn't Thomas Merton, but someone like that. And he said this about what's the role of a teacher? And I rather liked his definition. He said a teacher is there to get in the student's way until the student tells them to get lost.
I like it. Oh, that's brilliant.
Isn't it?
It's
Absolutely,
very apt. That is, yes.
isn't it? Isn't it? You know, but of course,
Because it shows the students then doing their own research and discovering, and yes,
uh,
brilliant. I'm
but
going to
also,
even
also point out to get this, independence can't just be, I'll be independent now, blah. It's just you've got to, there is an act involved in doing it, becoming independent. And I did it, I remember doing it a tiny, tiny way, but the effect it had on me with Bennett, and I loved the guy and what he was doing. And every year he had this set of groups and people assigned and so on, and it came around. This was before he went to Chevron. And that year I just didn't join. I just didn't join. And I was a bit anxious, all on my own, everybody else joining in. That's the first thing you get. You become independent, you're on your own. And you don't get that cosseting of being inside the group. You all speak the same language, which in that context means you never think anything different. Yeah, you're a slave to it and so on. But it really taught me something that, and so if you truly because it's like it's a notion of free will, God giving man free will, but it's got to be realized in a way. So it's only there when people are genuinely undergoing what's needed to make a free decision or something like that. It doesn't come just by signing up. Just like it can hurt,
it
and
means
this,
diving deep into oneself.
yes, it does. Oh. the laws. These,
So we've got
uh,
triamazicamno, heptapara and
that's
the others.
that's the two main ones, and because I was right from the beginning, I sort of said, why three and seven? You know, because later on I suddenly realized that Bennett really deeply thought about this, and he said, "Why just three and seven? Why can't I have the lot?" And so he changed it and then deviated
Sorry,
from
say that
data.
again because you broke up then. Just as you said, and Bennett said,
Okay,
yeah,
why just three and seven? Why
right.
not all the other numbers?
Hmm.
And so he created what he called systematics, you see. But this is a clash of attitudes here because I just so astonished hearing Gurdjieff people go on and on citing the law three and the law seven, and I say with no justification for it. There's no, it's just entirely, it's like being a member of the Catholic Church or something, relying on the creed, the dogma. You're just accepting the dogma, whole scale, you know. And I think this phrase from Lewis Welsh, inexorable law. What the hell does that mean when referring to sevenfoldness? And uh,
The sevenfoldness, I must admit, I do find difficult, but I've seen it in other, like it's in theosophy, it's in anthroposophy. I see that it's in quite a lot of the ancient um, teachings as well. So there is something about the number seven, and cosmology. And I understand the law of three is to do with us here on Earth, and I can see how the law of three kind of works. Sometimes it confuses me, but
there you are. This is quite sensible what you say. Let me tackle it. And well, first, a few general comments about law. See, what in God's name does he mean by law? Uh, because it's got these emotional overtones to it. When you put down law, you think policeman, or do you? Or what do you think? Or God,
yeah,
it's
something higher than us to look after us or in charge and authority.
yeah, that's right, or suppressing us, what anything. But the word inexample is like something like a completely mechanical law, a prison. This is what it's defining. It's that kind of mixed up language, first off. And so you get law of different kinds. You see, you get divine law, you get
Secular
legislative
law.
law. Pardon?
I said secular law. What did you say?
Well, I can't remember, but a lot as a statutory law, the law associated with policemen and governments and legislation and so on, because this is all temporary. And you get physical law, of course, and these have different meanings, and within each category there are different meanings and so on. But there is, the moral law, in a sense, Kant said the starry heavens above us and the moral law inside us, to do with conscience and so on. They're using the word law in very, very different ways. And, and if you say religious law, it could be a law as put in the book, so to speak, or a law of conscience or something. It could have all range of meanings. But the tendency is to want this to be absolutely determined and fixed. Is that the language associated with it is deterministic. The people say you can't escape it. You can't escape this law. I couldn't make any sense of this whatsoever. Now you refer to all these references. Yes, no. Cosmology in the seven. And also, I was thinking of the seven rishis. Uh, I'll throw in another one of my favorites, the Pleiades, and the mystery why there are seven Pleiades, but only six are visible, and which belongs to it. It's supposed to be one of the most ancient stories, which is global, and so on, all this kind of things. And it is certainly true. But this thing has been traced by scholars, and here I must refer to them, even though I can't remember the names, of course, but there's a certain woman who's done a lot of work on this. And it goes back to our dear friends, or my dear friends, the Sumerians and ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. And this extraordinary culture, which I find much more interesting than the Egyptian one. And there's a lot of substantial evidence that this sevenfold way of thinking. It's a way of thinking in a way, but it's sevenfold. It's not necessarily as Gurdjieff's got the law seven. It's sevenfold thinking goes back at least 4,000 years. and it's in documents, Yeah. And it's also associated, which Gurdjieff rightly draws attention to, with music. And his statement that the ancients understood cosmic laws, but put them into this audible, tangible form of music, for the people. That was his general idea, which has something to say in its favor. But what, was known, he was writing about 100 years ago. That's Gurdjieff. And much is being found out, in particular, like uh, complex musical scales and theories of music are 4,000 years old. Now, notion of these scales appear to have passed on. And one way it did because of this form of writing, the cuneiform writing, the wedges in clay and so on, were kept on being used even for different languages. The next civilization was the Akkadian, which was Semitic, a different culture altogether. But it carried on, and it carried on with some of this knowledge right up to Babylonian times, who then influenced the Greeks. So eventually that's where, in a sense, Pythagoras didn't make it all up himself. It was ancient by the time he got hold of it and all the rest of it. See? Uh, I'm going to talk a little bit about the seven and understanding sevenness. There is, in looking at the meaning of a number, I have to say only that phrase, the meaning of a number seven. And that is a way of looking at it in terms of what are called partitions. In other words, it's how many ways you can make the number out of many parts. So seven can be 6 plus 1, 5 plus 2, 3 plus 4. But there's also a form of it which is very, very interesting, which is 3 plus 3 plus 1. Now, what's 3 plus 3 plus 1? How does that appear in word? It actually is there in the Jewish tradition as the menorah. It has three candles.
Yes, your three candles on either side,
Yeah,
and God, and the one in the middle.
that's right. Now, that is exactly the same form as Bennett used in his seminar of spiritual psychology, even though it's put upside down as the hourglass, so to speak. You see? And and it's really implicit in Asbailis' seven rays. It's the two wings and the central one. That's a very common way. Now, each of these appears in ancient literature and mythology and science and so on. But take that one of the 5 plus 2, which is the one prominent in astronomy. Why? Can you guess what the 2 refers to? Little challenge here.
Sun and moon.
Right, sun and moon, that's right. And there's those divided up in there, and the others were wandering planets. And these corresponded to metals. And of course, the sun is gold, the moon is silver, and you go down the line to Saturn, which is lead. Yeah. But that form, which is also you can find in China. In China, it takes the form of the yin and yang as the two, and the five elements as the five, as well as the astronomical. So it was, when you look at it, this sevenfold division, it was everywhere. And it's a way of classification. And there was this implicit belief that everything follows the same pattern. But that was in that pattern 5 plus 2. Now, 6 plus 1, you get some mystical literature talking about the seventh and the sixth. But then you can notice that in the Enneagram, the law of 7 is represented by 6 plus 1. 6 is the cycle, and 1 is the top point. People don't really understand that the top point is part of the law of 7, and why it is part of the law of 7. So there we have all this evidence. Now, it's said that this transmission out of Mesopotamia right through to this incredible time Gurdjieff was aware of and made use of. This is the thing. That's the Jews in captivity, the Babylonian meeting of various people who were sent there or taken there by the Persian, in the Persian Empire, I believe it was. I can't remember the king at that time. And so these people from these different cultures were brought together. Some of them were Jews, and some of them were Persians, and so on. Some of them were Greeks. And Pythagoras himself was supposed to have gone there in about the same time. That's where Gurdjieff gets his society of adherents to legomenism. One of them was Pythagoras. Is He's mythologized this meeting, but it's known that they then brought this sevenfoldness. It was amplified in the Arcadians who went through all these thousands of years, and the Jews picked it up there, and it became fundamental for them. And including this notion of the 7 days of the week. Now, the week is a weird measure. Why is it weird? Because the day is something really physical. The turning of the earth, you see. A year is something physical, the going around the sun. A month, well, we get, and that's to do with the lunar cycle. You see this kind of thing. But the week, why a week? But it was there, we think it was imprinted from ancient Mesopotamia right through to the Jews who took it up and make a lot of it, make a great deal of it. So it became a carrier for many things, but it had nothing to do with Gurdjieff's account of Heptaparaparshinok. Well, it's a mixture because he says different things in different places. But one thing I will immediately talk about now as I gather my scattered wits together with all this highfalutin cosmology and so on. But just a good way, I just want to emphasize that there is of course, there's an ancient, long history of something like the value of seven, but that in history you get different cultures begin to enfold, or I think it's the best word I'm going to fold or store significant meanings in something in an archetypal form, which one kind is number. So these numbers become numerous. They acquire charge in that society because it enables them to draw together the diversity into one scheme. And so this notion that sevens are everywhere really was there in ancient times. But it was sometimes pointed out, I haven't followed this up too well, that the 3 and the 7 are really characteristically strong in Western civilization. For example, they could jump to the Amerindians and so on, and from the Asiatic. There's the enormous meaning of number 4, the 4 directions, this kind of thing. It's an immense structuring, which has the same charisma. You see, it's totally different. It leads to the notion of the medicine wheel, which is usually portions of 4 and the 4 directions and this kind of thing, and where you enter it and the rest of it. So there's that. So the 3 and 7 belong to us, and Gurdjieff seems to leave out the 4. And then you may have left out other things too. That marvelous diagram Gurdjieff introduces of the diagram of everything living. You remember I call it a staircase. Can you visualize it? It's all coming up and down there. Now, it's interesting that it seems that Gurdjieff brought a number of things as showing to people, almost to see what works, what helps them, what gets a response. And it doesn't appear much response to that diagram of everything living. I think the only one who really looked at it and did some research, you see, was Bennett. And it became his scheme of essence classes, and which depended on, in a sense, the law of 5 is a pentad at the heart of it. But he's the only one who ever looked into that diagram of everything living, as far as I know. It was known in ancient times by the name the Great Chain of Being. And there's a whole book by Professor Lovejoy about it, which is really, in a sense, a total bore, because he's all about who taught who what, who said what to whom, and all that kind of stuff. Goes on and on for pages. But it's only Ben got hold about this. It's the Togo alter egocrat. It's the feeding chain going through. It's just, but all these organic, meaningful connections, which is only Bennett has brought out from it, you see. And Gurdjieff never did. He just, because he must have said, well, think about it. But it didn't come back to him. He didn't bother. He just left it there, you see.
Didn't he say everything eats everything?
Yes, that's the reciprocal maintenance and all of that. But the diagram is very specific in its structure and its design. You can see the enormous work went into these things. They didn't just or maybe they did cook them up on the back of an envelope. But this is really, it is the whole design of the steps is fivefold, and the numbers and what it's food for and what it eats. And Bennett saw this notion of the higher nature and the lower nature. Um, so he put the work in. That's what Gurdjieff wanted, and that's what he. So when he saw, well, he came across it, the Law 3 and Law 7, he loved Gurdjieff and his work and wanted to believe in it. So he stuck with his first version of his dramatic universe. It's all about justifying this strange numbers, the 3 and 7. But he actually justified three numbers, 1, 3, and 7. And 1 became the symbol of being, okay. 3, the symbol of will, okay, Trinity. And 7, the meaning of function, which was Bennett's system. We don't go into here now about this threefold triad, cosmic triad, and so on. But then when he finally published it, he's got the whole 12, and he's flown in the face of Gurdjieff, you see, because Gurdjieff had this fanatical, there are these two cosmic laws. There is one of 7 and there is one of 3. And this is the truth which you will go forever and ever. Amen. You know, which is what it comes over like some people. And to see people on podiums talking about law 3 and 7, as if they're reciting some arcane formula, just or some token name of a god or something. It's just unbelievable. There's no energy of discussion of these things at all.
But I hope maybe Gurdjieff only did Law of 3 and 7 so that people would go and look at what the other numbers mean, like what Bennett's done.
That could be. That could be. Well, there's the rub about all of this. Maybe we'll come back to it before we finish. I was trying to think of what I've forgotten. You know, those things when you try to think about it, you've forgotten. It's just unbelievable. Uh, sort of thing. But then we come to his well, two things. I'm going to come to the what he called the ala atapan, and the other is the octave.
Mhm.
I used to, when I was working in my Enneagram book, and I came to say, the part you put a thing with stars on, the octaves, they really P da 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 D me off. uh, uh,
So tell us about the Ataban.
well, if I go there if you like that out of and I come back to the octaves. The other band was the device because that's yeah, I want to talk about Gurdjieff's technology. It's absolutely amazing what he does with this. I mean, it's so intricate. You only got that device, which I know was Chinese or something, and then you got the scientists on Saturn, Gunnar Harhak, and so on. And you got things done by Hajar Struve in a cave, and many examples where he's got, oh yes, in meetings, these wonderful apparatuses where the priestesses line themselves so they can learn the gestures for the movements. That machine, do you remember? Not remember that machine? Okay, it's when they
Ah,
go.
see, I remember the Hassif in the cave making the plants grow and shrink.
No, 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 no. This is for the movements, in particular. It's in the when they go to the Samuel Monastery, and it's
Oh, yes, okay. Or
yeah,
the
that's,
apparatus that they had in the
that's
monastery.
right. And it goes on to detail how these gold plates are in inscriptions of how to do it, and you've got these balls you rotate them, and it's so intricate, you see. And I try to get myself and other people to look at it, but we just reach a certain point and go, duh, we don't know. But it's extraordinary, and with the spaceships, ridiculous spaceships, even with silly is what they call it. Um, oh God, it's on my mind. There used to be a
Or how they
cartoon.
work.
What?
Well, how the spaceships work.
How to work? Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think there's a parallel. An English humorist used to write something Robinson. Uh, um, he was renowned for in the cartoon inventing weird devices, and Gurdjieff's description reminded of it. It's like a little arm reaching out and turning a switch, and it's just ridiculous. Um, but the point was that he did do it, and he was certainly trying to portray himself in the model of an empirical scientist. See, these people did experiments and they made observations. They're scientific. But of course, what he's describing is being observed and set up and discovered and talked about and so on is contrary to actual science. You know. Uh, but it's so persuasive. And going back to Ala you had three kinds of phenomena compared. One was light, the other was sound, and the other was chemistry, opium in particular. Now, the thing is, you see, and he implies that they all line up, but they line up, it is implied, you're not clear about this, in structure. You see, you can talk about sevens, just as seven items, but structure in a certain form, inside that structure is another matter altogether. And it comes to sound and music, there are different what are called scales, which divide that continuum into different steps. And the point is there are innumerable kinds of scale. You choose this one. But coming back to, yeah, so we have something like a musical scale there, implied or suggested. Then when it came to think, what do you think of? And so we think of Mr. Newton, dear old Isaac, his optics, and the splitting of white light into its several colors. I'm using the word several. Around the time, or, with hundreds of years of Newton, most scientists at that time described the rainbow in terms of five colors, not seven, five. Um, and look at what is now taken by most historians of science, why Newton said seven because he felt there ought to be seven. Why there ought to be? Because he was aware of that tradition we were speaking about from Mesopotamia, which relied on what's called Chaldean science, which had this in it, and he was a believer in that ancient science
Of the law of seven.
of the law of seven. But it was a belief because the number of colors you see depends on who you are to a large extent, because we've all been brought up with it. Richard of York gave battle in vain was the mnemonic for the colors: red, orange, yellow, or the green, blue, indigo, violet. I think I've gotten it right. Uh, but you ask anybody what are the colors range, well, they say there's seven. They come out with that and what they are and so on. But a lot of people don't see them. Why? Because it's a perceptual property, and it depends on what you expect to see. This kind of thing. So what I thought, then I looked at it, I thought, look at this, there's Gurdjieff exploiting Newton's mistake. No.
But Gurdjieff also said that we don't see all the colours.
Oh, that's right, but that's another, now that's a good example of this, because he talks about that, and so he can start waving his hands. And talk about, he says we only see the negative spectrum, and there's a positive spectrum, and blah, blah, blah. That's all very nice, we see, but in terms of his claim about this apparatus and what it's like, it it casts not casts a shadow. It's like a hypnotic. No, it's not hypnotic. It's a seductive. It's a seductive light in the sky. Speak about these other possibilities instead of saying, well, what is actually there? So he's got this particular. He has fun in the particular thing, as his boyhood story. They're having a fight and the tooth get knocked out, and there's a drop of moisture on every fang, but there are seven fangs and each has one color and spectrum. You see all of that. That's pure fabrication, And see, well, why are you doing that? It's just, why are you telling these silly stories? Well, I know people buy into it. So I'm arguing that there he was an example of it. And I'll give another kind of example of good to do with music, because I've tried desperately. It's very hard to get into this history and theory of music. It's so complex in some way. But where he has, let's see, I can't remember now exactly the point here. It is the, you see how easy it is to slip.
On the
But his,
Gurdjieff music.
well, not in Gurdjieff's music himself, no, his description of music. But The essential point is that in his, this is still, and it almost relates to what we started with in terms of groups just slavishly quoting Gurdjieff's stuff without going into it. Because he, I don't know if you remember, but his law of the octave, or the law of seven, as in Certain Miraculous, it's got this dramatic form to it. You know, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, the two special intervals, which is, but it's only the major scale of C which has that form. It's one form out of thousands of forms of the octave. He's chosen that form. But what? That's okay. But nobody at the time seems to have queried him about this. You know, Svensky didn't. And I think, why? It's a more extreme case, I think, than only having three and seven and not asking about the other numbers.
But wouldn't only a musician know that? I would not have known that because I don't know how to read music.
Uh, well, possibly, but it's a pretty accessible thing
Right,
of
okay.
music because I think even most people know there are different keys, for example, and so these video are different forms of the octave. You get some sense of it from that. But the keyboard as such, the standard one is very, very interesting. It goes back to ancient things. Go on.
So you froze then, the keyboard as such.
Oh God. It's very interesting structure. It goes back to ancient times because it has the two numbers in it of 12 and 7. It is 12 because there is this what's called circle of fifths. Now you do have to know some music to know what the fifth is. If you get the octave, do it in numbers, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, then the fifth note is the note sol. Now, in terms of frequencies, it's 1.5 times the frequency of do. It's called a fifth, but you just all you need to know is there's a certain interval, you see. Now, if you get 12 of these, they're going up and up, up and up and up and up. This is the same size on your keyboard as 7 octaves. Keyboards mostly have 7 octaves to them, you see. So you always had known from ancient times the circle of fifths, which enables you to calculate all kinds of scales, 12. And octaves, 7. They've got a relationship between 12 and 7. Now, this is a exciting thing because it's astronomical too, because it then becomes the 12 becomes the zodiac, you see, and the stars. The 7 are the planets, and they're the wanderers and the movers. So it's a beautiful representation itself on the piano. Most people don't know that. Okay. But it is a dramatic model. But I've said, and I want to repeat this, there's no traces I know of anybody ever questioning why is he using one form of the octave as a universal law. To me, it just doesn't make sense. I also noted with my dear John Bennett, when he wrote his whole book about the numbers in Volume 3, Dramatic Universe, and he goes to number 7, he doesn't even mention Gurdjieff's law of 7. Because I think he really realized this is a load of twaddle. He does many other things, but not that. And in his own writings, he never brought in that law of 7. But why? I just wondered historically, why was there no questioning of it? Yeah. But then the untruths he propagated, he took in this Heptapower Parshinok chapter, which is very complicated, as you know. And he started yattering about the Chinese brothers who are in the octave and various things, and the Greeks. And it's quite scurrilous in a way. He seemed to be hell-bent on doing down the Greeks, you see. And the Chinese are all wonderful, and the Greeks are idiots. And he comes out with this statement somewhere. The Greeks only had pentatonic music, it's based on 5, whereas the Chinese has 7. This is historically completely wrong. Why did he do that? And it tied in with my book, talking about things completely wrong. When with Mr. Bennett, he went to see after the war the wonderful case of Lascaux, when people could still go inside them. They went in and see it, and it's wonderful, as you know. Gurdjieff insisted they were only 6,000 years old, these paintings. And Bennett was trying to say, no, then we know that 15,000 years old. And Gurdjieff said, no, only 6,000 years. But why? What is this? Why does he do that? Uh, so there is a problem with that law of seven in that well, in the backward respect. He based it absolutely on this musical octave. And this is the thing which appears in the Enneagram, of course. 3 points, da, da, da. Shock comes in, then you've got to go through the rigmarole. Why is there a shock at point six as well as at point three? And, because there are three octaves and it gets really interesting. Law of seven. I've tried to find out whether any other person besides Gurdjieff treated the seven in terms of that model of the octave, and I haven't found it yet. But it's
There is a
kind
guy that has looked into that. He's been on my channel. I don't know if you ever met him at the A&D, Dylan. He has been looking into this on
who?
his channel. Dylan, I'm trying to remember what, I'm going to quickly look him up, but Dylan has been looking into this. Well, you continue because I think his work's quite important.
Yeah, that's what I say.
Um, I can't remember what name he's using on YouTube. I'll have to go through my stuff, but maybe I can add that in the notes later or something. But I know someone is dealing with that.
Oh,
Um,
that's good, isn't it? Yeah, there've been I know a lot of attempts. I mean, there was a man, the I was an old friend of mine. He was also very keen on Steiner, and he looked at the Enneagram. He talked about different sonorities, and there's somebody recent who's gone into that sort of thing. Um, but yes, it is relevant to know. Because, of course, one thing which happens with something a little bit complex like that, you can begin to generate all sorts of explanations for it.
Dylan Stevens, so I'm going to interrupt. Dylan Stevens is the guy that does a few YouTubes about this. His YouTube's channel is called Oldies But Dillies. He's been on my show a couple of times. And he was, because I found his paper he gave at the All in Everything conference. I believe it was in Seattle when he first started talking about this. Maybe he wasn't at the Seattle one.
I don't think so.
Yeah, and he was talking about how the octaves are in wrong places. And then later on in his research, he started saying something along the lines of, is it the different octave, different keys? Or I don't know. I get quite confused because I'm not a music person myself, so I don't
Yeah,
get it.
the, the music
So I
theory.
recommend Dylan Stevens, or perhaps I can hook you two up together to chat.
Well, if you find a reference to a video of his, I'd be
Hmm.
uh, grateful uh, to
But
do it.
people don't like other people doing that kind of research, or the what I call the old school who don't want to expand or look further. Because
Yeah,
I'm with you on this. Gurdjieff is not the be all and end all. He said to us to go and continue.
that's right. Of course, going back to Denis Thoran, that wonderful record of their conversation, which I presume is real and valid, and he said Gurdjieff valued the West because it had this expertise, this discipline, which you don't find in the East, and it's related to uh, accuracy and skills and so on. And he presented a very even-handed picture of the two cultures, even though, of course, East and West are very crude designations. It's certainly true. And I think he even said today sort of how there were people in Europe who really understood the whole thing as well as in the East. And he was very, I say, even-handed between the two. And but of course, and it's again why it's surprising going back to music because the whole kind of way Western music and Eastern music is on the whole quite distinct and quite different, based on a different approach to things. And he would have been aware of Eastern music, from where he was, and he's traveled in Asia and so on. But as I would say to people, look, one of the basic Hindu scales has got 22 notes to an octave in it, you know. But no mention of this, but the whole tradition of Eastern music is that, and going back to his wrong statements about the Greeks and the Chinese, you see, the pentatonic scale as such is pretty universal. It's in all general, it's in all what is called folklore, And I think the reason for this is that if you get notes from any part of the pentatonic scale sounding together, they're pretty agreeable. Whereas the heptatonic scale, if you press the two notes, long notes together, they clash. You
Mhm.
see, so it's a bit more tricky. Pentatonic is therefore easier. You don't make so many mistakes, so it therefore it's natural for folk music. That's my explanation for it. Uh, but it's, I say, it was quite wrong that the Greeks had this only. They have some, because all cultures carry on with the pentatonic scale, because I think it's folk music. It's what everybody plays easily. Now, what should we do next?
Well, I'm going to have to go soon.
How soon? Oh God.
Yeah, I have to. We've got about 20 minutes left.
Okay, we do
But yeah, I
something.
just made a couple of notes, maybe about what you've been talking about that I just wanted to. So I just wanted to throw something at you. So the word law, LAW, and then there's the word law, LORE, which is about myths, isn't it? And old stories.
Lore,
Yeah, and I just when you
not
was
yours.
talking, I
Yeah,
couldn't
yeah.
stop
Oh, I'm glad you
thinking.
came up with that because
Yes, well, you was talking, and I'm just like, I wanted to throw it at you. Isn't that interesting? Law, the
yeah,
law,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
law telling us all the
That's
folklore.
wonderful. I just came up with that a year or two ago, and I just began to rewrite not the law seven, but the lore of seven. Yeah, you're right. Now this is coming. That was coming down. There was the main focus about these laws and so on. Now I'll say something briefly about that. We might just get a follow up um, to tack on because I've blessed you for finding that. As you see, this is in a way it's a kind of pragmatic aspect of these laws. If you stop being highfalutin and absolutist about this, what I call the fascist mentality, then you can get something from it, you see. And I contrasted in a little essay wrote about this good parent Gurdjieff approach with the scientific one. In 1956, there was a paper published which actually became in a psychology magazine, which became one of the most widely read of that genre ever, and was called, and I think I've told you about this before, the magical number seven plus or minus two. Now, this is really empirical. It's looking into information processing and the capacity of a memory stores and the span of attention. It sort of got into the machinery of our psychology. It's based on all of that. I thought there is the contrast. This is the true Western thing, which is looking at things like probabilities, and this is approximations. This is what people have found out more or less because you have to take into account individual variations. People can discern things differently in this kind of thing. But this is it. This is really authentic empiricism. But Goethe goes on about this absolute law. That's the contrast. And I think the absolute law and so on, for me, smacks of the East, which I always tend to think of as very authoritarian and controlling. And I'm still I'm old-fashioned. I'm in the minority one, I think. I really appreciate the Western civilization for attempting to do things that the East never did, like make equality between men and women and giving freedom of speech. And they're always getting into trouble. It's easy not to get into trouble by putting people under a strict control and telling them what to think. There's no problem. Look, the
Yeah,
peasants are
we'll
not
make sure that
revolting.
does not happen to us in the Western world.
Yeah. Yeah, we're in a mess. But you think people say, sure, wrong? No, it doesn't. There's something brewing. Well, that's my optimism in it. But simply, yes, the law. And I mean, I looked at things, and so I got back into literature and fairy stories, and this is attracting me, excuse me, more and more. These things they've been doing, like writing plays and poetry and saga and telling stories for well, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps, what it is. And they in across these cultures in just an organic way. They're being learned to find out what works. It doesn't work, and I sort of watch YouTube things on how to construct a film script. It's worked out in some detail, and they've got evidence to show if you follow this sort of scheme, you're on better luck of doing a good movie, which will be a box office success, than if you don't do it this way. Because it's a wonderful structure, and it's just a repository of know-how about the human psyche, which is of great value, the nature of stories. And this is what I think the thing which was being tapped into by people like Eliot, T.S. Eliot, and James Joyce, and in different ways was Gurdjieff, which is this ancient wisdom. The ancient wisdom is in the psyche, so to speak. It's buried there, and it's in language and all these things which Gurdjieff looked at, the dances and the monuments and all of that, which relates to his marvelous woman's work, Miss Kelly, God, the memory code, which I think is absolutely wonderful. But it's because it's connected with what she writes, connected with how to read it and how to make it and what happens to those people who can do it and initiates and all of that, but won't have time for it. Just one final word about one word about the law of three, and I think it's very striking for me about the contemporaries of Good. You see this man who's a bit older than him, the greatest American philosopher I love, Charles Sanders Peirce. His he said he did blatantly. He said, I'm not an enemy of any number, but I like threes, he said. And so metaphysics is based on three injustice. And he
Freeze affects a lot of people. Nikola Tesla did everything in freeze, but that was kind of like what I suppose today we would say was OCD or something. He walked
yes,
around buildings 3 times before he went in them and things like
yes,
that.
he
And I
had
know
written.
free affects a lot of people.
Yes, people are caught up onto Tesla with his magic. He vowed that number 369 was the secret to everything, but then they invent what it is. But going back to Sanders Peirce, there are two things I'll say to that. His work got taken up recently by an English theologian called Robinson. He talks about God symbolism, and which he shows how Peirce's metaphysics translates into the Trinity and how it translates into experience in a most extraordinary way. But Peirce had the greatest impact on, of course, semiotics, the meaning of science, and he went from this ordinary world. I also like to put this in. You've got a word like, I don't know, pen, and you've got the object pen. You see, that's as far as people go, and they say, well, we give the name pen to the object, like, as purely by convention, and that's it. There's two terms, the sign, the word, and the pen, and it's arbitrary how it's one's attached to the other, you see. But he said, no, there is these three. He said there was OS3, and he introduced his third term, the interpretant. And so you take any sign, like a word, and it can be other kinds of things, and then you have to bring to bear is you recognize how it's being used. Like there's a way of, if you're talking about, I don't know, I can't think of good examples now, but ways to think of objects, then there's a way of doing it which everybody understands. And this has been taken up by people throughout the world. It's quite extraordinary. So he's actually almost there tangibly got an exemplification of the third force, which is in Gurdjieff, but it was all developed by this man dealing with language, years before Gurdjieff started writing his stuff. Uh, and so that, how to say it, it's fruitfulness. Is there somebody in a way with it's got an an independent insight into the law of three. And I say it's the law of three, but it's expressive of how people have come to work with language, how people have learned to work with something, how people learned how to make something. And I think I'll try and make this my last comment. I always love this part of the Duino elegies, Rilke, and the first elegy, and he's talking about the angels in comparison with man, in comparison with animals. So you have the three realms. He's talking about angel who surpasses us and everything. Then he says, show him making, and he will be the more amazed. The rope maker, the potter. And that for me was the big clue, you see. It's how things are made. This is also why I detest, in a way, even though I can see some interest in it, the shadow enneagram of personalities, because it's got no contact with the reality, this human reality. We're always making things, and we were faced with this task of creating ourselves and giving labels to different people. It's just because people like to think about themselves, compare themselves with other people, but it's to destroy this pleasure in making. So we better stop there. I don't know if it's any good,
Oh, this was
Debbie.
amazing. And I think with this show, we've created a lot of food for thought for people and even for people even to think about numbers. And if you're pondering on numbers, obviously Tony would like to know more about numbers and the different laws. I was thinking William Blake, law of four, his fourfoldness.
Oh, yes, it was.
Also,
Yes,
that's number four sorted. So thank you ever so much, Anthony, for this wonderful show. And thank you
oh,
everybody for watching. I'm DJ Elliot 142857. And you can come and get in touch with Tony through the diversity website.
yes, I hope so. I'm always behind in the administration.
Get
Anyway,
connected with the community there.
yeah. Yeah, and we have a very, very important session coming up soon, which we're going to be have the contributions from Joseph Aziz, one of my dearest friends, and then one I respect and extremely much. But he's going to talk about his book about John Bennett and the inner exercises, because Joseph has. I hope he'll say something about them. I don't know. These are the extraordinary exercises Gurdjieff created during the Second World War, which have only recently been kind of brought into the light. Anyway, thank you for so much support and help and um, sparkle.
I
Uh,
look forward to next time, as always. It's always great talking to you.
yeah, let's raise the banner. Cheers up. Now I've got to find out where is it? Where's the here we are.